Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPautos.com, your libertarian car guy. I wanted to talk a little bit this morning about driver's licenses from a number of different points of view. The first is that they really don't have much to do with driving in the sense of demonstrating that you have at least a basic minimum competence to operate a vehicle. Certainly not in the way that having a private pilot's license, for example, at least shows that you do know how to fly an airplane. Maybe not at the level of the Blue Angels, but you're at least competent to take off and land, having demonstrated that you can do that. Very, very little in the way of skill is required any longer, or demonstrating skill is required any longer in order to obtain a driver's license for a car. And that's because it's essentially morphed into a government-issued permission slip, an ID. You know, this has happened over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, there was at least some sort of vestigial sense that you had to show you could drive. They had driver's education in high school. You had to show that you could maneuver a little bit out on the road, typically, not in the parking lot of the DMV like they do now, if they even do that. But, the broader question is, does a driver's license actually serve the purpose of qualifying drivers? And, I don't know. I'm kind of ambivalent about this. Got into it a little bit with Bill Meyer in a friendly way on the air the other day. A caller called to ask about that. And I got to thinking about it, and it just seems to me that the government should not be involved in this at all. And I know immediately some people are going to say, well, if we didn't have driver's licenses at all, if anybody could just get in a car and drive, why? We'd have all sorts of bad drivers out on the road. Well, submitted for your approval. Go out for a drive and see all the bad drivers. Probably 99% of them have a valid driver's license. I think it rests my case, doesn't it? It doesn't show that people are competent to drive. It just shows that they have a government permission slip. I think there's a much better way to weed out the bad drivers, and that is simply consequences. I've had this argument with regard to gun control, as they put it. Of course, there's nothing to do with controlling guns. It has a lot to do with controlling people. Over the decades, when I point out that, all these restrictions on people who aren't the problem do is impose restrictions on people who aren't the problem. I think that gun crime, which is a better way to put it, or people who use guns to commit crimes, could be addressed far more effectively by having severe consequences for the criminal or reckless use of a firearm. You put somebody in the clink for 20 years or longer for brandishing or something of that nature, and it's going to be a strong incentive to handle your firearm responsibly. And at the same time, the beauty of it is that the people who are responsible and who aren't criminals don't get hassled. Similarly, I think the way you can handle all this stuff with regard to driving is to leave alone the drivers who aren't causing any problems, meaning the drivers who don't wreck. Ipso facto, as Bill Cosby used to say once a long time ago, I don't care how many tickets and all these other things you have on your DMV record. The bottom line is, if you don't wreck, that means you're a good driver, period. I think it's inarguable. You show that you know how to control your car, that you have good judgment, that you have situational awareness. You don't wreck. That really ought to be all that matters. On the other hand, if you do wreck, it shows, or it strongly suggests, that you weren't paying attention, that your skills are kind of subpar, potentially that you're irresponsible, even perhaps criminally so. Okay, fine. In that case, hold those people responsible. You wreck a vehicle, you should be held accountable for that. And again, this kind of ties in with the insurance stuff. I don't think people who don't wreck should be having to pay high insurance costs. I think the people who wreck should be the ones who pay high insurance costs. Does that make sense to you? And this sort of stuff just scales throughout life, I think. This is sort of a libertarian premise, if you will, foundational idea, and I think it's solid. I think it stands up. Judge people individually according to what they do, not what they might do, and more finally, not what some other person worries they might do. Oh, heaven forfend, they might be doing something. Stop it. That's neurotic. Get your feelings under control. Deal with facts. Imagine if the courts dealt with facts. Imagine if in the context of things like crimes, you had to prove the person was a criminal in the sense that he'd harmed somebody. If you can't produce evidence that somebody has been harmed by the actions of another person, whether we're talking about physical harm to their person or to their property, if you can't produce harm, show a victim, then it should be dismissed You know, this idea that you affronted a statute. Think how weird that is. Bizarre. That people are actually put in prison or fined. All these things, they're punished because they violated a statute. Oh. You know, I mean, it's insane. At least it's profoundly at odds with any kind of a humane, reasonable, intelligent society. It is the emblem, in my opinion, it's emblematic, in my opinion, of a profoundly disjointed, immoral, arbitrary, authoritarian kind of system. Anyway, those are just my thoughts for this morning. More over at EPautos.com, the web's best libertarian gearhead site. Thanks as always for viewing. Catch up with you again soon.